So it's almost the 12th anniversary of the collapsed Mexicana de Aviacion, which was one of Mexico's two flag carriers until 2010 when the airline collapsed. But I'm not really going to be talking about that specifically, nor am I going to be talking about what the airline was like back then, but rather what if somehow Mexicana still existed today? What would they be like? What would their fleet look like? What routes would they operate? Among other interesting questions. I should mention that this is going to be based mostly on my own research and my understanding on how the airlines industry tends to work, as well as my personal opinion. I'm not going to get into the financial side of it because I don't particularly understand it, but I'm also going to be as realistic about it as I possibly can. Although I should say, it really is impossible to say what would have actually happened because we're never going to know. There are many gray areas and many scenarios that would play out and many possible starting points as well. Really, my most realistic theory is that if Mexicana didn't collapse, then Aeromexico will be the one to collapse instead. But in this analysis, I'm going to assume that Aeromexico somehow survives as well. Aeromexico and Mexicana were both government owned between the years of 1994 and 2005, during which the two were acting as one airline, until they were sold separately in 2005 and began to compete with each other. Not sure about Aeromexico, but it is known that Mexicana was sold for a lot less than it was actually worth. And I guess this is where my alternate universe splits from reality. Starting in 2005, in my universe, Mexicana is sold to a different owner, but to its real value. A different owner that would run the airline differently. When it comes to Mexicana's fleet, I'm going to base myself starting on Mexicana's fleet in November 2005, which according to planespotters.net, they had a total of 10 Airbus A318s, 16 Airbus A319s, 19 Airbus A320s, 5 Boeing 757-200s, 1 Boeing 767-200ER, and quite a few Fokker 100s that were being transferred to Mexicana's local subsidiary, Click. By the time the airline collapsed, the airline had about 10 Airbus A318s, 26 Airbus A319s, 25 Airbus A320s, as well as 3 Boeing 767-300ERs and 2 767-200ERs, as well as 2 Airbus A330s. The fleet of Boeing 757s was retired by 2008, and the airline also received 15 Bombardier CRJ-200s for their subsidiary Mexicana Link that was founded in 2010. They also ordered the Boeing 717 for Mexicana Click. But my timeline between 2005 and 2008 would be likely not have that many difference, with a few exceptions. The airline would have received the Boeing 767 and launched direct flights to South America. The 757 would be removed from the fleet as well, but the launch of transatlantic flights with the A330 would be delayed until around 2012. The Mexicana Link subsidiary would not be launched, but rather Mexicana would focus more on the local subsidiary Click, with the Fokker 100s in the early 2010s. I would definitely keep the A319s and the A320s and the 767s. I will keep the 767-200ERs for a while, but later replace them with more of the 300ERs instead for fleet commonality. In this timeline, Mexicana will have likely filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in around 2009, but it will get out of it in around 2010 or 2011. After restructuring itself around cutting unprofitable routes and getting rid of some of the older planes, the shorter routes could be transferred to Aeromar, while Aeromexico will likely take over some as well. Once the airline comes out of bankruptcy, they would order around 6 US Airbus A330-200s to begin their transatlantic flights to Madrid and later on to London Gatwick, although they could move to London Heathrow later on. And the airline seat configuration would change, introducing 3 different classes, with Mexicana's improved business class known as Elite Class for some reason, Premium Class being Premium Economy with extra legroom, and Coach being Mexicana's Economy Class. Mexicana's A318s and A319s would be retrofitted to have only premium and economy seats to be operated on Mexicana's less premium routes. Some of the A320s would also have similar configuration. The remaining A320s would have all 3 classes for their more premium short-haul flights, and so would the wide-body 767s and A330s. In around 2013, Mexicana will likely end up placing an order for 25 Airbus A320neos and 15 of the Airbus A321neos to begin replacing and upgrading the A319s and A320 fleet. This order will likely increase years later, maybe to add another 25 A320neos. The entire A321 fleet would have all 3 classes. Many of the A320neos would have all 3 classes as well, while the remaining A320neos will have only 2 classes. Another order that Mexicana could also place in around 2015 is for at least 12 of the Airbus A330-900neo to replace both the 767-300ERs and the A330-200s, and later on an order for around 30 of the Airbus A220s, split between the 100 and 300 variants to replace the A318s, the A319s, and the Fokker 100s. As of 2022, well, the airline would have been heavily affected by the pandemic, I'm not sure whether they would have filed for bankruptcy like Aeromexico or not, because the situation would have been very different. But this would probably be the point where Mexicana retires the A318s for good, as well as the older A319s and A320s. It is likely that the 767 would be retired at this point as well, in order to have an all A330 widebody fleet. In my universe, this is what Mexicana's fleet would look like in 2022. About 20 of the Airbus A220s split between the 100 and 300 variants, with another 15 on order. These will have premium economy and economy class, with 115 and 140 seats respectively, and will be flown on the lower demand domestic and international routes that the airline has, although some could likely fly from Mexicana subsidiary Click on an all-economy configuration. About 15 of the Airbus A320s that would likely have premium and economy with no business class. These will have about 164 seats and will be used for many of Mexicana's domestic and international flights. These will be in the process of being replaced by the A320s and A321neo. 35 of the Airbus A320neos, of which 15 will have business class while the other 20 would not. There would be around 25 on order that would be split between those with business class and no business class. These new orders would replace the remaining A320s. The business class A320neos will have 150 seats, including 12 in business class, and will be mostly used on the busier routes that have a lot of business demand or light competition, mainly out of Mexico City and Guadalajara. 15 Airbus A321neos, with another 10 on order, all of which will have business class with 194 seats, including 16 business class seats. They will fly mostly on the busiest routes and those with a lot of business demand, mainly out of Mexico City. About 8 Airbus A330-900s, with possibly another 7 on order, with 257 seats, including 28 business class seats, 35 premium economy seats, and 186 economy seats. These will fly the longer flights to Europe and South America, although I feel short-haul flights to Cancun, Los Angeles, and Bogota could probably handle such an aircraft during their downturn in Mexico City. Lastly, 4 Airbus A330-200s with about 24 seats in business class, 28 in premium economy, and 143 in economy that will fly the lower demands long-haul destinations like Barcelona, Rio de Janeiro, and likely a few short-haul destinations like Cancun, Bogota, or Los Angeles. This will likely end up being retired within the next few years and be replaced by the Airbus A330-900s. Now, what about the A350, which many think that Mexicana would have ordered if it still existed? I'm really not sure such a plane would end up working for Mexicana, or Mexico would be ahead of the long-haul game, so Mexicana would be better off with smaller A330neo to better compete with Aeromexico's 787s. And I feel like the A350 will be a bit too big for many routes. Sure, for Madrid flights it might be great, but other markets are either too small, can work just fine with the Airbus A330-900, or will have competition with Aeromexico and aren't as big markets as is Madrid. In my opinion, there would have been 3 ways that Mexicana would have ordered the Airbus A330-900s. One is if Aeromexico collapsed. 2 is if Mexicana did something extraordinary like build a hub at Cancun, which is unlikely. And 3 if Mexicana launched flights to Asia, which is unlikely since Aeromexico entered that market first. The main reason why I'd be downgrading some aircraft and removing business class is because of the competition with Aeromexico and the low-cost airlines. Aeromexico would likely take the place as the main full-service airline in Mexico, and many routes are either too small to have more than one full-service airline flying the route, while some busier routes could probably make a second full-service airline work, hence why some aircraft will have business class. When it comes to Mexicana's network, I'm basing myself on this 2005 map. We see that obviously the focus is largely around Mexico City, with some around Guadalajara, as well as a few point-to-point routes, while Aeromexico and other regional airlines fly a lot of the routes that Mexicana doesn't fly. Most of Mexicana's network today will be based around Mexico City, in a network that will probably look similar to the one that Interjet operated during its last days, with around 30 domestic destinations, including new destinations that Mexicana didn't fly to, such as Chihuahua, Torreon, and others, competing more directly with Aeromexico, while some of Mexicana's short-haul unprofitable destinations would be terminated and transferred to Aeromar or taken by Aeromexico. A significant part of the network would be based out of Guadalajara, with around 27 destinations, including several destinations in northwestern Mexico that wouldn't have Mexico City flights, such as Ciudad Obregón, Loreto, Los Mochis, and others, as well as flights in central Mexico to fit onto not just the northwestern flights, but also to the US flights from Guadalajara. Point-to-point flights could include Tijuana and Monterrey to Cancun, for example, or León and Morelia to Tijuana, maybe. Mexicana's international flights would likely increase as well, and they would be mostly based out of Mexico City, with about 16 destinations in the US and 3 in Canada. This would include some of the airline's old destinations, as well as new destinations like Houston, Philadelphia, or Sacramento. Other flights would include around 6 destinations in Central America, 4 cities in the Caribbean, as well as 4 cities in Colombia, and more cities in South America, while flights to Caracas remain suspended. The main hub for Mexicana's U.S. operations would actually be in Guadalajara, with around 20 destinations in the U.S., mainly to California, but also to other parts of the U.S. as well as possibly flights to Toronto and Vancouver in Canada, and to Bogota and Lima in South America. Cancun will likely have a few US flights and a few South American flights into the Caribbean, but probably not nearly as many as there would be from Mexico City. There will also be flights into Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, Fort Worth, and others that from several smaller Mexican cities like Leon, Zacatecas, Morelia, Aguascalientes, and others, of which Chicago and Los Angeles would likely be focus cities similar to how they were in the past. Meanwhile, there will only be 2 European destinations with daily flights from Mexico City to London Heathrow and twice daily to Madrid. Maybe Frankfurt and Barcelona could be added later on, while Madrid could also get flights from Cancun, Monterrey, and Guadalajara before Aeromexico had the chance to begin these flights. Although these could probably be flown by Iberia instead. Mexicana's partner airlines would be quite helpful in capturing a lot of the US market, which would allow for many flight additions to the US, to American Airlines hubs, as well as US Airways, which ended up merging with American, and lastly there's Alaska's entrance into One World, which could offer many connections into many US markets. Other One World partners would include the likes of Iberia, which would help in the very important Spanish market, as well as British Airways, Qatar Airways, Japan Airlines, and other connecting airlines. There would be a lot of benefit from other partner airlines as well in their respective areas, such as Air Canada in Canada, Avianca and LATAM in South America, although LATAM would likely end up ending ties and switching to Aeromexico after leaving One World, as well as Lufthansa, Turkish Airlines, ANA, Emirates, and others that began flying to Mexico City, as well as airlines that fly to airports like Chicago or Los Angeles, while other airlines could offer connections like Cathay Pacific, Air New Zealand, Qantas, Royal Jordanian, and many other airlines. Now, what will happen to other airlines like Aeromexico, Aeromar, Interjet, Volaris, and Viva Aerobus? Aeromexico would, of course, be the main competitor of Mexicana. They will likely have some similarities in the existing airline, but likely a few differences when it comes to flight frequencies and destinations. They will likely be the main full-service airline and the main international airline, while Mexicana would dominate the US market, Colombia, and Spain. Aeromexico would dominate the rest of Europe and most of South America, as well as Asia, operating more wide bodies than Mexicana would. Mexicana would fly to most cities in Mexico from Mexico City, but Aeromexico will fly to a lot more cities with a regional aircraft and would dominate the market in Mexico City, as well as some flights in Monterrey and Tijuana, but Mexicana would still dominate the domestic market because of the hub in Guadalajara. Interjet could fly more out of Toluca and also have a few flights from Guadalajara, Monterrey, and Cancun, and possibly a few flights out of Mexico City, but they wouldn't be too big. I feel like any Mexican airline under this universe were to go bankrupt, it would be Interjet. Volaris would also compete with Interjet heavily at Toluca and will heavily dominate Tijuana, while also having some operations out of other airports like Guadalajara, Leon, Querétaro, and other airports. Sure, some Mexico City flights, but not nearly as many as they do now. Viva Aerobus will fly out of Toluca some, but focus most of their operations at Monterrey and Cancun, as well as some point-to-point operations from other airports, including a few from Mexico City. Aeromar would likely end up being allied to Mexicana and having a close relationship with it, whether it would just stay as an independent airline that codeshares with Mexicana, or whether it could simply become a subsidiary of Mexicana. Either way, they would likely be operating regional flights that might have been too small for Mexicana to operate while acting as a feeder for Mexicana's own flights. Speaking of subsidiaries, not talking about Aeromar here, but about Click, Mexicana's local subsidiary. I'm not really sure whether that subsidiary would exist in my universe because I don't really know how it affected the airline economically. But at the same time, other low-cost airlines like Volaris, Viva Aerobus, and Interjet would likely crush it. But assuming it did exist, this would be based out of other airports outside of Mexico City. Most of their flights being domestic and operated by the Fokker 100s on an all-economy configuration, to be later replaced by the fleet of Airbus A220-300s. Assuming this subsidiary didn't exist, the same A220s would just simply be used for mainline operations. When it comes to Mexicana Link, I would have just never launched it at all, especially not with a plane so small and uneconomical as the CRJ-200, and especially not in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis and the middle of the swine flu pandemic. It would just be better off to just leave that market for Aeromexico and Aeromar. I really don't know what Mexicana would actually be like if it still existed today. I would absolutely love for that to be the case. They've been talking for over a decade about bringing the airline back, but we have to be realistic. It is better for the airline to not come back because I know that if they bring it back, it will not be the same airline, and it will face a lot of heavy competition from Volaris, Viva Aerobus, and Aeromexico, which dominate the aviation scene in the country. And it's fun to fantasize about it, but sadly we had to come back to reality. Mexicana ceased operations on August 28, 2010, about 12 years ago, and it's not coming back. Thanks for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. If y'all got any comments, questions, or any feedback, y'all can leave a comment. That's all I got to say, and I'll see y'all later.